"You don't belong here. Go back to admin work where you're safe." Staff Sergeant Derek Kozlowski said it in front of the entire formation at Fort Moore, his voice dripping with contempt loud enough for 200 officers to hear. He had no idea the woman he was dismissing, First Lieutenant Mara Cashton, 28, with 2 combat deployments and a Ranger tab most male officers would kill for, had already put 3 trained fighters on the ground in under 90 seconds during her last classified assignment. The morning air went cold. Everyone watched, waiting to see if the new female officer would fold or fight back. But Mara didn't argue. She locked eyes with him and smiled. 30 seconds later, Kozlowski was on the mat screaming with a shattered fibula, while 200 witnesses realized they had no idea who she really was. What none of them knew, what even Colonel Whittaker couldn't access without clearance from JSOC, was what happened in Helmand Province that made her the kind of weapon the Army only deployed when failure wasn't an option. Fort Moore, Georgia felt heavy in late October 2024. The air hung thick even before sunrise, and the main parade ground stretched out under streetlights that buzzed like insects waiting to die. Mist rolled low across the grass, catching amber light and turning everything soft at the edges. Boots hit pavement in rhythm as officers formed up for morning physical training, the sound bouncing off buildings that had witnessed 50 years of soldiers learning to lead. First Lieutenant Mara Cashton stood at parade rest near the rear of the formation, her body so still she could have been part of the architecture. 28 years old, 5'9", with dark brown hair pulled back regulation tight. She had angular features, sharp jaw, pale green eyes that absorbed everything without appearing to focus on anything specific. Her uniform showed no wrinkles. Her boots caught what little light existed. But it was the way she held herself that made people look twice, not tense, not aggressive, just present in a way that suggested she had already calculated 3 exits and memorized every face in formation. She touched her left forearm briefly, fingers brushing fabric that covered ink no one here had seen. The movement lasted less than a second before she caught herself and stopped. Colonel Raymond Whittaker stood on the platform addressing the assembled officers of the maneuver captain's career course. He was old Army, grey hair cropped close, lean frame that spoke of decades maintaining standards, voice that carried without strain. He talked about expectations, about the 12 weeks ahead, about how this course would prepare them to lead companies in combat. Mara had heard variations of this speech across 3 different installations. She focused instead on faces around her, captains fresh from their first platoon time, the instructor cadre standing along the flanks, the handful of female officers scattered through the formation like exceptions to an unwritten rule. Staff Sergeant Derek Kozlowski stood 5 rows back, arms crossed over a chest built in weight rooms rather than ruck marches. Thick neck, close-set eyes, the kind of permanent scowl that suggested he took everything personally. She had marked him yesterday during in-processing. The type who confused volume with authority and treated respect like something people needed to earn from him specifically, regardless of rank. If you're watching from anywhere right now, drop your location in the comments. And if stories like this matter to you, hit subscribe. These aren't the stories they teach in history books. Colonel Whittaker dismissed the formation. Officers dispersed toward the dining facility, conversations rising in the cool air. Mara turned to follow when Kozlowski's voice cut through the noise. "You don't belong here. Go back to admin work where you're safe." The words landed like a challenge. Heads turned. The morning got very quiet very fast. Do not use quotation marks anywhere in the story. Mara Cashton learned about leverage before she learned algebra. Her father, James Cashton, had spent 23 years as a Marine Corps martial arts instructor at Quantico. Their garage in Fredericksburg, Virginia had doubled as her training hall from age 6. He never treated her like she was delicate. He treated her like she was capable, which turned out to require considerably more work. The first time she broke someone's arm, she was 15. A high school senior named Travis Mahue had cornered her friend Beth behind the vocational building, hands where they shouldn't be, voice low with threat. Mara approached calmly, asked him once to step away, and when he grabbed her shoulder instead, she applied a standing armbar her father had drilled 500 times. The radius snapped clean. Travis dropped. The school suspended her for a week. Her father took her for ice cream and explained that the world would always punish women who refused to be victims, but that didn't make refusing wrong. She joined Army ROTC at Virginia Tech, graduated with honors in 2018, and commissioned as an infantry officer 2 months after the branch opened to women. Her first assignment took her to 1st Battalion, 5 of 8th Infantry Regiment at Fort Bragg. She earned her Ranger tab on her second attempt. The first attempt ended with a failed patrol evaluation when her exhaustion made her miss a terrain feature. The second attempt she passed by refusing to sleep more than 2 hours in any 24-hour period for the entire 61 days. Her first deployment came in early 2020, northeastern Syria as a platoon leader with a mechanized infantry company supporting Operation Inherent Resolve. The Euphrates River Valley in summer registered 120 degrees by noon. Dust coated everything. ISIS remnants operated in cells that melted into civilian populations like smoke into air. First Lieutenant David Brooks had been her company executive officer, 33 years old, married, 2 daughters whose pictures he kept in his helmet band. During a raid on a suspected weapons cache outside Ash-Shadadi, their element took contact in a half-collapsed compound with 3 walls and exposed sky. An RPG detonated against the corner structure, turning concrete into shrapnel. Brooks took fragmentation across his lower abdomen and left femoral artery. The wound too high in the groin for a standard tourniquet to hold pressure effectively. Mara dragged him into cover while rounds cracked overhead. She applied direct pressure with both hands, her gloves soaking through in seconds. She called for medevac on a radio that hissed with static and distant voices promising help that felt like it was coming from another continent. Brooks kept talking about his daughters. Their names, their ages, what they liked for breakfast. He made her promise to look after the young soldiers, to never let them face the dark alone the way he suddenly felt himself facing it. She said yes. She meant it with everything she had. The helicopter arrived 18 minutes later. Brooks had stopped breathing 3 minutes before that. The army gave her a Bronze Star with Valor device. She wore it once at the ceremony, then locked it away and never touched it again. What she carried instead was the weight of that promise and the specific texture of Brooks' blood drying on her hands. After Syria came Ranger School, then reassignment to Fort Benning as an instructor candidate for the Ranger Training Brigade. That assignment lasted 6 months before an unusual request came through channels. Special Forces needed a female officer for liaison work in Afghanistan where conventional units couldn't operate effectively. Cultural support in a war zone where gender mattered tactically. She deployed to Helmand Province in late 2020, working with an operational detachment Alpha running village stability operations in districts where women wouldn't speak to male soldiers. The work was slow, dangerous, and resulted in intelligence that prevented 3 separate suicide attacks in Lashkar Gah. She returned stateside in mid-2021, 2 weeks before Kabul fell, with capabilities she couldn't discuss and a service record that contained more redactions than details. The tattoo on her left forearm showed a dragon curved into the shape of a balanced scale, its tail forming the fulcrum. She had gotten it in Jalalabad during a 72-hour pass between operations. A reminder that strength without control was just violence waiting for a target. Do not use quotation marks anywhere in the story. The combatives' training bay occupied the eastern wing of McGuinness Wickham Hall, a high-ceiling gymnasium with industrial lighting and blue mats covering concrete floors. By 0900 hours, the space held 200 officers from across the career course, arranged in formation along the walls while instructor Kadri demonstrated techniques at center mat. Staff Sergeant Kozlowski had 21 years in service, most of them with conventional infantry units that deployed to Iraq during the surge years. He knew the combatives' manual thoroughly, moved with practiced efficiency, and carried himself like someone who had never encountered a problem his rank and experience couldn't solve. He also believed, with the conviction of doctrine, that women in combat arms represented political theater rather than tactical capability. He had made this position clear during lunch the previous day, something about bone density and upper body strength ratios and how standards had been adjusted for social engineering rather than combat effectiveness. Captain Nina Reeves stood beside Mara now, jaw set, arms crossed. She was a military intelligence officer, 31 years old, prior enlisted, with exactly zero tolerance for performance art disguised as instruction. She spoke quietly without moving her lips. Half these guys think he's right. The other half won't risk looking soft by disagreeing. Mara said nothing. She watched Kozlowski demonstrate a rear choke escape, his technique textbook correct but lacking the fluid adaptation that came from actual application under stress. When he finished, he scanned the assembled officers with the expression of a teacher selecting the student most likely to fail publicly. His eyes settled on Mara. Lieutenant Cashton, front and center. The gymnasium went silent in the way spaces do when everyone simultaneously stops breathing. Mara walked forward without hesitation, boots making soft contact on the mat. She stopped at parade rest 6 feet from Kozlowski, spine straight, hands behind her back, expression neutral as glass. Kozlowski smiled. The expression didn't reach his eyes. He explained to the room that they would run through progressive defensive scenarios, starting simple and building complexity. He framed it as educational opportunity. What he was actually constructing was a demonstration, public proof that women couldn't handle the physical realities of close combat. Mara understood this immediately. She also understood that anything she did now would be analyzed, dissected, and weaponized regardless of outcome. The first technique was basic, a front shoulder grab. Kozlowski reached for her with obvious telegraphing, giving her every opportunity to respond. She executed the prescribed manual defense cleanly, redirecting energy and creating separation. Professional, controlled, exactly as doctrine specified. Kozlowski nodded, his face registering mild surprise. He called the next technique a front choke attempt. Again she responded with textbook precision, breaking his grip and establishing a controlling position that left no room for interpretation. Around them, the quality of silence shifted. Officers leaning forward now, paying attention for different reasons than they had been 30 seconds ago. By the fifth iteration, Kozlowski's smile had vanished. His breathing had elevated. Frustration showed in the set of his shoulders and the way his hands opened and closed between techniques. He called for an advanced scenario, a combined takedown attempt with high choke, something typically reserved for later course phases when students had built more experience. He came at her faster this time, using his weight advantage to try overwhelming her structure. Mara moved like water finding gaps. She slipped his initial contact, trapped his extended arm, and transitioned into a standing armbar that bent his elbow backward at an angle that made people in the front row wince visibly. She held him there, not straining, not forcing, just maintaining pressure with mechanical efficiency, then released and stepped back. Kozlowski's face had gone red. He straightened, rolled his shoulder, and looked at her with something considerably darker than professional rivalry. He announced they were going to run that scenario again. His voice carried across the entire gymnasium, and there was no mistaking the edge in it. Do not use quotation marks anywhere in the story. That night Mara sat in her barracks room with lights off and window cracked, letting October air wash over skin that still felt overheated from the day. Her hands ached, not from Kozlowski, who hadn't actually landed anything significant, but from the sustained tension of keeping them loose when every instinct screamed to finish what he kept starting. She flexed her fingers slowly, watching shadows move across a caustic tile ceiling. The room was standard issue temporary housing, government furniture that smelled like industrial cleaner and old linoleum, wall hooks holding gear arranged in exact order, boots aligned by the door. Her desk held a single photograph in plain black frame, her father in marine dress blues standing beside a younger version of herself at her OTC commissioning ceremony. His hand rested on her shoulder. His expression carried pride mixed with something she had spent years trying to name. Recognition maybe, understanding that she was walking into a fight that had no defined endpoint. She thought about Brooks. Not the memory of him dying. She thought about that every day regardless, but specifically about what he had asked her to do. Look after the young ones. Make sure they never feel abandoned the way he felt in those final moments when darkness closed in and help was still minutes away. She had carried that promise through everything since. Through Ranger School when her body wanted to quit. Through Afghanistan when the isolation felt like physical weight. Through every moment when it would have been easier to accept a staff position somewhere safe and fade into comfortable obscurity. This situation with Kozlowski wasn't about ego or pride. It was about every female soldier who would come after her, who would face men like him in positions of institutional authority, who would need to know it was possible to stand ground without compromising standards or dignity. If she backed down now, if she let his disrespect establish precedent, she was sending a message to every woman in uniform that their presence was negotiable based on the personal opinions of whoever happened to outrank them locally. She touched the dragon tattoo on her forearm, traced the curve of its spine with one finger. Her father had taught her that strength without discipline was just destruction, and discipline without purpose was just theater. She needed both. She needed to be strong enough to handle whatever Kozlowski constructed tomorrow, and disciplined enough to respond with precision rather than anger. Outside her window she could hear voices from other barracks, officers decompressing from the day, laughing about something she couldn't distinguish. Normal concerns, normal lives. She had stopped having those somewhere in Syria 3 years ago, and she wasn't certain she wanted them back. Maybe this was who she was now, a solution to problems other people created, a weapon they needed but resented. She let herself drift towards sleep, already visualizing movement patterns for tomorrow. Do not use quotation marks anywhere in the story. Morning brought rain, cold, steady, the kind that soaked through everything and turned training areas into ankle-deep mud. Colonel Wetaker appeared in the gymnasium doorway at 600 hours and announced modifications to the training schedule. Combative's instruction would continue, but it would now incorporate stress inoculation protocols. Full protective equipment, multiple opponents, scenarios designed to test tactical decision, making under progressive fatigue. He presented it as routine adjustment. The way his eyes tracked to Kozlowski while speaking suggested different intent entirely. By 0800 the mats had been reconfigured with obstacles, overturned tables, equipment bags, anything that could simulate confined operational environments. The course cadre divided officers into working groups. Mara's group consisted of herself and 5 male captains, all of them taller by at least 4 inches and heavier by 30 to 50 pounds. Kozlowski would serve as primary evaluator, cycling them through increasingly complex scenarios with cumulative difficulty. The first evolution was straightforward. Navigate through the obstacle course, identify the designated hostile played by a cadre member, neutralize the threat using appropriate force. Time limit 90 seconds. Mara went third. She moved through the course with economy of motion, identified her target, applied a control hold that immobilized without causing injury, and stepped clear. 68 seconds. Kozlowski marked something on his evaluation sheet without comment. The second evolution added variables. 2 hostile role players instead of 1, reduced lighting. A simulated casualty they had to protect while engaging threats. Mara went first this time. The scenario placed her in a corner with a training dummy representing the wounded soldier and 2 instructors approaching from different angles. She used terrain, let the first attacker overcommit to his approach, redirected him into the second, and established control over both within the time limit. When she exited the scenario area, breathing elevated but controlled, several captains were watching her with expressions that had shifted from skepticism to recalculation. Kozlowski's jaw was tight. He called a break, then pulled Mara aside while others rotated through. He explained that the next scenario would be different in structure. Multiple opponents with no time limit, full contact parameters, continuing until she either neutralized all threats or called safety halt. He framed it as advanced assessment for high-performing students. What he was actually constructing was a scenario designed to overwhelm through sheer volume and sustained aggression. The evolution began at 10:30 hours. 4 role players, all senior NCOs, all male, all briefed to maintain intensity within safety boundaries. Mara stood center mat wearing protective headgear and padded gloves, her uniform already dark with sweat from previous iterations. Around her, 200 officers watched from the perimeter. The air felt charged. The first opponent came straight at her. She redirected, used his momentum, put him on the mat. The second came before she could fully reset. She caught his extended arm mid-motion, transitioned to a standing armbar, controlled him until Kadri called him out. The third and fourth attacked simultaneously from opposite directions. This was the breaking point. 2 trained fighters coordinating approach with no time to think, only react. Mara dropped her center of gravity, felt the first opponent's strike pass over her head by inches, drove her shoulder into the second opponent's sternum, and used his body to shield against the first. She rotated, trapped an arm, applied pressure until she felt the tap out. 3 neutralized, 1 remaining. Staff Sergeant Kozlowski stepped onto the mat. He had removed his instructor vest and equipped protective gear. He looked at Mara with naked hostility and announced to the room that this was the final assessment phase. Officer versus senior NCO, full contact, submission or safety halt. The gymnasium went absolutely silent. Mara understood with perfect clarity what was happening. Kozlowski had abandoned any pretense of professional instruction. This was personal vindication, an attempt to humiliate her publicly, to prove his worldview correct in front of everyone, to re-establish natural order as he understood it. She could call safety halt right now. Claim exhaustion, no one would fault her for it. She had already exceeded expectations by any reasonable standard. She rolled her shoulders, reset her stance, and nodded once. Kozlowski came at her like he was trying to walk through her. No finesse, just aggression and mass, attempting to overwhelm through pure physicality. She absorbed the initial contact, redirected his momentum, felt him adjust and drive forward again. He was stronger than the previous opponents, more experienced, and motivated by something deeper than evaluation standards. He wanted to break her. Not permanently, not enough for actual disciplinary consequences, but enough to make his point stick. Mara gave ground. She absorbed strikes on her protective equipment. She let him think he was winning. She waited for the moment his confidence would create opportunity. It came 45 seconds in, an overcommitted straight punch, his weight too far forward, his right leg exposed and planted. She swept his leg, hard, fast, with all the rotational force her hips could generate. Kozlowski went down sideways, his knee bending at an angle nature never intended. His fibula snapping with a sound distinct enough that officers in the first 3 rows heard it clearly over their own breathing. He hit the mat and screamed, a raw sound that cut through the gymnasium like an alarm. Do not use quotation marks anywhere in the story. The gymnasium detonated into chaos. 2 medics sprinted onto the mat while officers scrambled to create space around the injured NCO. Kozlowski lay on his back, clutching his right leg below the knee, face gray with shock. Breathing in short gasps, Mara stood 5 feet away, hands at her sides, expression neutral despite adrenaline flooding her system hard enough to make her fingers tingle. She had not intended to break his leg. She had intended to end the engagement decisively, to force submission, to establish control. The fracture was a consequence of his refusal to acknowledge he was beaten, his determination to prove something that had already been disproven. Colonel Whittaker materialized beside her, voice low and completely calm. He asked if she required medical evaluation. She said no. He told her to step off the mat and let the medics work. She complied immediately, moving to the water station while cadre members secured the area and the crowd of officers pressed closer, trying to see what had happened. Captain Reeves found her 3 minutes later. Her expression was complicated, concern mixed with something that looked like grim satisfaction. She spoke quietly. Half the room is calling it an accident. The other half is calling it excessive force. Kozlowski's friends are already talking about formal complaints. Mara drank water and said nothing. She had learned years ago that explaining yourself to people who had already decided you were wrong was wasted effort. The investigation launched that afternoon. 2 majors from the Maneuver Center of Excellence legal office took statements, reviewed security footage from the gymnasium surveillance system, and interviewed witnesses. What they found was unambiguous. Kozlowski had initiated full contact engagement outside standard training parameters. He had failed to submit despite being in a compromised position. Mara's technique had been controlled, precise, and consistent with defensive doctrine. The injury was unfortunate, but neither criminal nor negligent. What the investigation also uncovered, because Colonel Whittaker personally ensured its inclusion in the record, was Mara's complete service jacket. Not the sanitized summary printed in course rosters, but the detailed file that included her Ranger tab, her Bronze Star citation, her work with Special Forces, and a letter of commendation from a colonel at JSOC who described her as one of the most tactically proficient junior officers he had encountered in 32 years of service. The revelation moved through the officer population like electricity through water. By the next evening formation, everyone knew. Lieutenant Cashton wasn't just another new infantry officer trying to survive the career course. She was a Ranger, tabbed combat veteran with credentials most of them would never approach, skills they couldn't replicate, and a record that explained everything. Why she moved the way she did, why she carried herself the way she did, why nothing Kozlowski threw at her had created even momentary doubt. The dragon balance tattoo on her forearm became immediate focus. One of the female lieutenants asked about it during the next training break. Mara explained its meaning: strength tempered by control, the constant work of maintaining equilibrium between capability and restraint. The lieutenant listened with complete attention, then walked away carrying something she hadn't possessed before. Staff Sergeant Kozlowski received a General Officer Memorandum of Reprimand and immediate reassignment to Fort Stewart in a non-instructional capacity. The investigation determined he had violated multiple training protocols, created a hostile learning environment, and allowed personal bias to compromise professional judgment. His career would continue, but the trajectory had permanently changed. He would never teach again. 3 days after the incident, Colonel Whittaker summoned Mara to his office. He sat behind a desk buried in paperwork and regarded her for a long moment before speaking. He informed her that the Ranger Training Brigade had submitted a formal request for her assignment as instructor cadre for their next integrated assessment cycle. They needed someone who could mentor female candidates preparing for Ranger School. Someone who understood the specific challenges they would face. Someone whose credibility couldn't be questioned or dismissed by anyone. He asked if she was interested. Mara thought about Brooks, about the promise made in a Syrian compound while rounds cracked overhead and help came too late. She thought about every soldier who would follow the path she had helped clear. She said yes. Do not use quotation marks anywhere in the story. 3 months later, Mara stood on the gravel pad outside the Ranger Training Brigade headquarters at Fort Moore, watching January sunrise paint the Georgia sky in shades of orange and gold. The air was cold enough to see breath, the kind of morning that made you question decisions but also felt honest in its discomfort. Behind her, 28 female soldiers prepared for Ranger assessment phase, their faces set with determination mixed with barely concealed fear. She had spent the previous 12 weeks teaching them everything she knew, not just technical skills, but the mental architecture that made survival possible when your body demanded you quit. How to find strength in exhaustion. How to lead when no one believed you could. How to carry the weight of other people's doubts without letting it crush your spine. One of them was Private First Class Jordan Mendoza, 19 years old, from a small town in West Texas where most people told her infantry was a mistake. She had approached Mara after the first week and asked how you dealt with people who didn't think you belonged. Mara had given her the truth. You proved them wrong one repetition at a time, one task at a time, until evidence became impossible to ignore. And even then some people would never accept it, so you learned to find validation internally rather than externally. Mendoza stood in formation now, rifle slung across her chest, boots laced tight, ready for whatever came next. She caught Mara's eye and nodded once, a gesture of respect that required no elaboration. The Ranger instructors emerged from the tree line, faces painted, voices sharp, ready to begin the assessment cycle that would break most of these soldiers before the end of week 1. Mara had experienced this herself years ago when the stakes felt impossibly high and outcomes uncertain. She knew what waited for them: cold water immersion, heavy loads, sleep deprivation, constant evaluation, the grinding pressure that revealed who you actually were when comfortable lies fell away. Colonel Whitaker stood beside her now, observing the same scene. He mentioned that reports from the career course had reached the Pentagon. People were discussing changes to instructor qualification standards, better training for cadre working with integrated units, the importance of having mentors who could demonstrate rather than just lecture. Her name had come up repeatedly in those conversations. She had become, whether she wanted it or not, a symbol of something larger than individual achievement. Mara accepted this with the same stoic calm she accepted most things. She touched the dragon tattoo on her forearm, a reminder of what mattered. Balance, control, purpose. She had made a promise to a dying officer in a Syrian compound, and she was keeping it the only way she knew how. By ensuring the next generation had someone in their corner who understood their fight because she had already fought it. The sun cleared the horizon, the assessment began, and Mara watched her soldiers step forward into their own crucible, carrying everything she had taught them and everything she had learned in places most people would never see. The cycle continued. The work was never finished. And that was exactly as it should be.